Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 16. The Stone. Faldor opened his eyes. He stretched and sat up, rubbing his eyes as he yawned. He pulled a rough-spun shirt over his head and slipped into a pair of trousers. Rummaging through a wooden cabinet, he pulled out a small loaf of bread and closed the door. He walked out the door of his cabin and settled into a wooden chair, the lone occupant of a small covered porch. Faldor leaned back in his chair and put his bare feet on the railing before him. He tore a chunk of bread loose from the loaf and broke his night-long fast. He chewed the tasteless bread as he watched clouds gather in the sky along the distant horizon. Finishing his breakfast, he grabbed a large scythe from where it leaned against the rail and set off down the front steps. He walked to the edge of a large grassy field behind his cabin and looked around. The morning breeze tousled the grass, sending rippling waves cascading through the amber stalks. He raised his scythe and set to work. In short order he had a sizable pile of cut grass. He stuffed full a large basket and picked it up using the handle of the scythe. Centering the load across his broad shoulders, he carried the load to his cabin and deposited it near a small shed. Faldor collected a wheelbarrow and shovel and set off toward a small creek that ran near his cabin. A high bank rich in clay showed signs of recent excavation. He picked up his shovel and dug at the exposed bank, filling the wheelbarrow with the clay-rich soil. With the cart at capacity, he tossed his shovel atop the load and maneuvered the wheelbarrow back to his cabin. A large kiln oven belching smoke stood surrounded by stacks of square wooden forms. Faldor emptied the clay into a small pit and added the pile of cut grass. He hopped into the pit and used his feet to mix the grasses into the clay, creating a sticky, fibrous mass. Once again setting to work with his shovel, he began filling the wooden forms, packing them evenly with the fibrous clay. After the forms were filled, he gently removed the proto-bricks and fed them into the kiln. Finished with his morning routine, he retrieved a bucket of mortar from his shed and carried it to a small domed edifice. Picking up a trowel, he grabbed a brick from a nearby stack and set to work, adding another layer of stonework over the domed structure. Working tirelessly, he added layer after layer to the structure, though it never grew in size. He stopped and wiped grit and sweat from his brow. Every day he made bricks and reinforced the dome edifice. There was nothing else. For days beyond count he had kept his routine, dutifully adding layers to the structure. Once again he caught sight of the gathering storm on the horizon and pondered for a moment. "It'll blow over," he said as he spat on the ground. "They always do." Eric twirled his finger and an orb of light flared into existence. With a thought, he sent it careening into the depths of the pit. On and on it dropped. Reaching the bottom, it spun in place, twinkling like a star in the night sky. Peary looked confused. "Faldor? But he's been dead for eons." Eric shrugged. "I don't know how to explain it, but something is pulling me to venture down there and see for myself. I've never been surer of anything." Kaluka stepped forward. Then we will go see for ourselves. Peary nodded in agreement with the Mon Motavi. We're with you, said Hawk, making eye contact with Eric. Besides, I'm not about to wait around here for whatever horrible thing shows up next. Eric nodded. He held forth his scabbard. Take hold, he said. In a flash, the party found themselves at the base of the pit. The floor was littered with skeletons. Quintus's body, only the most recent addition. Shrouded in cobwebs, a stonewood throne stood ensconced within an alcove on the north side of the pit. A man was seated upon the throne. At first glance he looked like a statue, heavily mantled in the dust of eons, giving his outward appearance that of stone. Eric studied the ancient wizard king for several minutes. He lives, whispered the young chosen. He is living in the deepest of slumbers, ensorcelled and trapped in time like an insect in sap. He looked toward Hawk and Peary. Do you feel the power of this place? The raw magical energy coursing through the walls? This isn't a pit so much as a wellspring of natural energy, like a key line laid bare. No wonder he entombed himself here, he said in awe. The winds whipped, pulling the storm clouds closer and closer, darkening the sky over the dome. Faldor eyed the storm with growing concern. How long had it been since such a gale had blown over? The old man was hard-pressed to remember. Steeling his resolve, he grabbed a fresh brick and began to lay another row of stone over the domed edifice. He worked at a fervent pace. Mortar, brick, repeat. On and on he toiled, but still the storm intensified. It battered the dome, tearing at its shell as though it sought whatever lay within. Eric knelt before the ancient king. Closing his eyes, he quickly fell into a meditative state. He reached out with his senses. Opening his avenues of sight, he saw the lines of energy running throughout Faldor's body. It looked much like any other man, except the Wizard King's body was speckled through with jagged bursts of energy, sparkling with blood-red intensity. Faldor, unable to remove the tainted shards from his body, had entombed himself in this well to subdue the influence of Kairos's twisted magic. Eric considered the situation. The Wizard King had been unable to remove the shards, but perhaps he could. Eric focused his will on the foreign pieces of magic and began to pull them toward him. Driving sheets of rain pelted Faldor as he toiled, plastering his gray hair against his face. The daylight had been replaced by an ominous gray haze as the storm raged around him. Terrible winds buffeted the dome, tearing away layers of bricks as Faldor hopelessly struggled to repair the damage. The old Ka screamed into the storm as he fought to maintain control, but the burden was too great. The winds continued their barrage, and the last vestiges of the brick dome were stripped away, revealing a red light pulsating with malevolence and violent intensity. Bathed in the blood-red light, Faldor looked on in despair. Eric focused on the irregular energies, pulling them from Faldor's body. It leaked through his skin and rose into the air where it coalesced into a small, multifaceted ruby. It floated in midair between Eric and Faldor, the gem sparkling ominously, bathing the bottom of the pit in its crimson glow. With a thought, Eric pulled the gemstone to his outstretched hand. "No!" shouted Hawk, but too late. The jewel landed in his palm and shimmered for a moment before turning into a liquid and soaking into his skin. Eric's hand began to blacken and wither. He squeezed his hand into a tight fist and raised it high. "Close your eyes!" he shouted to his companions. Suddenly the tomb was filled with blinding light emanating from the young chosen's hand. Hawk quickly cast a spell of protection over the party, shielding them from the brilliant display. When the light dimmed, Eric's hand had returned to normal, all traces of the magical infection gone. Eric inspected his hand before smiling. "It's finished." As soon as the malevolent light was revealed, it had quickly disappeared, and with it gone, the storm had abated. The clouds fled from sight, leaving an open expanse of blue sky. Sunshine caressed Faldor with its many-fingered touch, warming his damp skin. He closed his eyes as waves of euphoria flooded through his body. For the first time in ages, he felt well. Hawk frowned and made to speak, but fell silent as Faldor's eyes suddenly opened. The intense blue of his irises gleamed in the light as a single tear ran down his dust-covered cheek. He drew in a ragged breath and coughed, causing dust to cloud around him. Hawk whispered an incantation, and the dust collected into a mass and dropped to the floor in a pile. Faldor inclined his head in thanks. Placing his hands upon the armrests of his throne, he slowly pushed himself into a standing position. The ancient wizard king surveyed the group clustered around him, his gaze lingering on each in turn. As his eyes fell upon Hawk, the wizened Ka staggered and fell back onto his throne. "So much knowledge," Falder mumbled to himself as he looked upon the Farron mage in awe. Among the gifts passed down through the Ka royal bloodline, the most prized and feared was the power of empathic impression. As Falder gazed upon those before him, he received the information of their life experiences as memories. From Kaluka, Piri, and Hoke, he learned of the state of his people and of the lands outside of Karas Fawn. But the sheer volume of knowledge in Hawk's mind had left the ancient wizard king in a momentary state of stunned silence. Lastly, his gaze fell upon Eric. Falder's eyes narrowed for a moment before he looked away, saying nothing. Rising again from his throne, he gave a short bow. "I have gleaned from your memories what has transpired. You have given me much to consider," said Falder in a raspy voice. The old wizard king waved his hand, and gears could be heard turning deep within the walls. Suddenly the floor of the pit jolted and began to rise, carrying them to the surface. They stared in amazement as they reached the surface. Gone was the domed ceiling and surrounding maze, replaced by a vast subterranean city stretching beyond sight into the distance. Lights began to shine, and the sounds of splashing water could be heard as fountains flowed. Finally, a great rumbling was felt as massive doors opened overhead, basking the city in sunlight for the first time in over 3,000 years. Once again, Karas Inn was in spring. The city vibrated with energy as the Ka celebrated. Falder had opened Karas Inn to the people of Karas Fawn, and already migrants streamed into the city from the surrounding forest. Feelings of hope and renewal permeated the air. A new age was dawning upon the Ka people with the return of their lost wizard king. Eric, Hawk, and Hoke sat in Kaluka's suite, reclining on plush couches as they waited for Piri to join them. It had been a week since Falder's awakening, and the Farrons were anxious to depart for the verdant valleys. Upon learning of their plans, Piri had expressed interest in accompanying them on the journey. Over the past several days, Eric had undergone numerous examinations by Hawk and Falder, but neither had found any trace of the stone in Eric's body. In the end, they agreed that the young chosen had purified the twisted magic of Karos. The doors to Kaluka's suite opened, and the Mon Matavi swept into the room with Galen and Piri in tow. The Ka mage was draped in a white hooded cloak, and he carried a small rucksack slung over his shoulder. "Friends," said Kaluka with a broad smile, "Faldo regrets that he cannot join us in bidding you a safe journey." Eric bowed his head in thanks. "He has more important duties to attend to, I'm sure," said Eric. Galen extended his hand, and he and Eric shook. "Thank you, Alik. May our paths cross again." They exchanged their goodbyes and then gathered around Eric, each taking hold of his sword's scabbard. "To the verdant valleys," said Eric, and the four vanished in a flash, leaving the Ka Motavis standing alone on the terraced balcony. Before. Falder placed his hand upon Piri's shoulder as he held the young Ka in his gaze. Piri stared into the Wizard King's fathomless blue eyes as they bored into his soul. "I couldn't read him, Piri, and that troubles me. The memories of others tell me that he is a god made flesh, and now he possesses the twisted magic of Karos. Do you understand the danger?" asked the old Wizard King. "Yes, your grace," replied Piri. Shortly after his revival, Falder had summoned Piri into the depths of Karas Inn. The pair stood before a vast mural carved into the bedrock of the mountain. It was a nightmare scene. Monstrous creatures tortured and devoured humans under a blackened sky devoid of sunlight. Seated upon a throne, watching the display with pleasure, was a man. Falder's voice was a whisper, as though he feared being overheard, even in the depths of Karas Inn. "Watch him, Piri. Watch him closely. Should Eric succumb to the corruption of the Destroyer, the giant that appears will turn Karos to a speck of dust." Epilogue. Althenia rifled through Hawk's desk, searching for any indication of where the young heiress of Kalan had gone. Shortly after their caper into Ordwak's suite and discovery of his treason, Hawk had disappeared. "Anything?" asked Warren. "Nothing yet," replied Althenia. Warren had appeared in Hawk's doorway shortly after Althenia's arrival, offering his help. She was happy for his presence. Hawk had expressed distaste for the young man, but Althenia found his affable company tolerable. A scrap of paper sticking from a volume on the desktop caught Althenia's eye. She opened the book and found a short note scrawled in Hawk's script. "Tell Margaret what we found. She'll know what to do." Warren glanced over her shoulder and read the note. He looked at Althenia with a quizzical expression. "What does it mean?" asked Warren. "What did you find?" Althenia bit her lip. She felt conflicted but decided to take Warren into her trust as she outlined what had been found in Ordwalk's hidden alcove. Evidence of bribery and collusion with the illegitimate king of Kartu. Warren shook his head in disgust. "I always knew the old bastard was cold, but I never imagined him as treasonous. We should go and tell Margaret right now. She's just returned to Terransay this morning." Althenia smiled and nodded. "Thank you, Warren," said Althenia as she turned around and set the book back on Hawk's desk. Searing pain erupted in her back as her breath caught in her chest. Her vision darkened and she slumped to the floor, a dagger protruding from between her shoulder blades. Warren yanked the blade free and wiped it clean on the hem of Althenia's dress. He returned the blade to the hidden sheath in his sleeve and quickly glanced out the door into the hallway. It was empty. He picked up Althenia from beneath her arms and dragged her out of Hawk's room, through the corridor and into a nearby servant's closet. He opened a hidden wall in the back of the closet and stuffed the corpse inside. Warren swiftly made his way through the tower and entered Ordwalk's suite. The old patriarch of House Kalan looked up from his desk, an anxious expression on his face. "Well?" asked Ordwalk. Warren sat down opposite the old man and looked him in the eyes. "She's gone," said Warren. "Nobody saw her leave, so all signs indicate that she jumped to wherever Hoke is." He paused for a moment before continuing. "But there's more. She knows, Ordwalk, about you and Xeris." Ordwalk gnashed his teeth. "Who else knows?" Warren smiled darkly. "Nobody drawing breath." Ordwalk smiled in satisfaction. Without a doubt his wayward daughter would adventure about with her useless brother for a good long while before returning to Terransay, giving him time to advance his plans free of her incessant meddling. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of the Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.